That's my dad and me. My dad sadly died when I was very young, really not a whole lot older than that picture. And so I don't have a lot of memories of him, but I do remember him as a man of few words. I can picture him in the living room at some sort of family gathering, of which there were many, because there were many relatives who all lived in close quarters, a number of them actually in the house, and next door and up the street and around the corner. I can sort of picture him there, sort of standing in the background, typically with an unlit cigar clenched between his teeth and a little smile sort of playing on his lips. There's a lot of laughter and talking, but I remember him as more observing it than in the midst of it. But the thing about some people who aren't the center of attention and who don't talk a lot is that sometimes these are people who really do listen to when they do talk. I think that was true of my dad. Anyway, I listened. I remember him saying to my young, crabby, whiny self, "Do you want me to give you something to cry about?" He never laid a hand on me, ever. That was enough. I got the message. But a happier memory was, you know that if they lined up all the little girls in the world, I'd pick you. And I'd say it again. Our gospel today is from Mark. Mark's gospel, as you might know, is the shortest one in the Bible, so I guess you could say that Mark was a man of few words. You might have noticed that the story of the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, that's our gospel for today, begins at the 29th verse of the first chapter of Mark. That means that in the very first 28 verses in this gospel, Jesus has been born, although Mark skips any mention of that, and baptized by John and driven into the wilderness for 40 days, a story that Mark tells in 2 verses, and one we'll return to in a couple of weeks. From the wilderness temptation, Mark summarizes what Jesus taught in exactly 1 verse, then tells how he acquired his first disciples and brings us to the synagogue and the events that we heard about last week, where Jesus leaves them all amazed by the authority with which he teaches, not to mention the dramatic exorcism he performs. And then we are on to our gospel today. I'm just saying, that's a lot to pack in so few lines. By the end of the first chapter, which is all of 45 verses long in Mark, Jesus is in the thick of his ministry, teaching and preaching, healing and casting out demons wherever he goes. At the close of the first chapter in Mark, whole towns are emptying out to find Jesus. Now you contrast this, for instance, with Luke's gospel. In his first chapter, it's 80 verses long, and when you get to the end of it, Jesus hasn't even been born yet. Now, why is this important? Well, for one thing, if you're looking to take on, maybe more scripture reading during Lent, hint, hint, you could try reading Mark's whole gospel. It will take less time than you think. Not a bad idea. We are dwelling in Mark's gospel this year, which means that more often than not, our lessons will come from Mark. And it's good for us that we attend carefully to what he says. If Mark spends 2 verses telling a story, well, we better pay particular attention to what he says and how he says it. So today I'd like to focus on 2 verses of what happened when Jesus came into Peter's home after the big scene at the synagogue. Mark says, "Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them." This is such a quiet, tender scene. You sense things sort of slowing down a bit. You can imagine Jesus walking toward that sick bed. He took her by the hand and lifted her up. Nothing dramatic in this healing, no shouts, no writhing on the floor, no words at all. Jesus touches her, takes her by the hand, and Mark says, lifted her up. The word in Greek is egeiro, to lift or to raise up. It's a word that Mark uses over and over in these healing stories, where those who are laid low by illness or unclean spirits, Jesus has the power to raise them up so they can take their place in the world. And in the end, the women who come looking for the body of Jesus in the empty tomb learn from the messenger that Jesus is not here. He has been raised. It's a small word, but a powerful one in Mark's gospel. Powerful, and yet, as I said, what Jesus does in our story today seems so ordinary. He takes her by the hand and lifts her up. It sounds like something we might do. It sounds very much like something we do. Think back over your own life when you have experienced the healing touch of someone in your life. Someone who called just at the right time. Someone who sent that note at the right time. Someone who said, "How are you?" in such a way that you knew they were actually serious. It might have been your doctor, but it might have been a friend, a family member, someone here at church who took you by the hand, took you in hand, asked how you were doing. It might have been someone who prepared a meal, as I said, or sent a card. Healing touch happens around here so often it would be impossible to name them all. The healing touch can come in words that are spoken or sung or even knitted. It can be a physical sign. The handshake or the hug at the door, the cross traced on your forehead on the Sundays we offer that healing sign. It could be the cup of wine, the bit of bread passed hand to hand. If your spirit is lifted in worship, then you too are egeiro, raised up, rejuvenated, restored. And Mark says, when Jesus lifted the woman up, her fever left her, and she could resume her life. That is exactly what every sick person really wants. And if you've been sick more than a day, you know this is true. You want to resume the most mundane things, washing the dishes and taking out the garbage, or fixing a meal at church. It's true, and you know it. And a person who is ill longs to stand up without feeling dizzy or nauseous or in pain. We all prefer, as we say, to do for ourselves. But it's even better when we can do something for someone else. The woman Jesus raised from her sickbed got up, and Mark says she began to serve them. Now in my Wednesday Bible study, that's a tough group, I'll tell you. Someone scowled and said, "How typical. The woman gets out of her sickbed and serves the men." Well, yes, rather typical, is it not? But there could be more to it than that. If you take a close look again at the word that Mark uses for served, it is diakonia. Deacon is where we get that. Deacon, the one who serves. You know, by the way, that the Lutheran Church sort of recaptured that language for minister of word and service, and we have our own deacon. Robin is a deacon here in this congregation, and we have the hope of another deacon joining us. Oh, there she is, behind the organ. Thank you for that. Nancy Trimble. So that's a hope and something that's in the works. Mark's, when he uses this word about the woman serving, this is extremely important. It is the same word that Jesus uses to talk about himself, that he has come to serve and not be served. It's what Jesus tells his disciples they must be about. And the first person in Mark's gospel to offer service is a woman, Simon's mother-in-law, whom Jesus healed. through this simple story, might not Jesus be showing us he has the power to take us in our need and lift us up and empower us to serve? Jesus calls his disciples, Peter and Andrew and James and John. He says, "Come and follow me," and they do so because Jesus speaks with that kind of authority that practically compels them to leave everything behind and follow him. Today, it's not the authority of his command, but his touch. When Jesus lifted up Simon's mother-in-law, she began to serve them. And I think Jesus was just sort of giving us a little bit of a "this is how it's done" lesson. Watch and learn. This is how you become a disciple, and this is how you are able to serve in my name. When I ask people, new people who've come to the congregation, what sort of impressions and what drew them to this place, very often they will say two things. And one has to do with how caring this congregation seems with all its many, many outreach ministries, and the other is that they were made to feel welcome themselves. And you know how it works. Those welcomed, in turn, welcome others into the presence of Christ, the healer, that they too might be lifted up. That's how the church grows. Is it not wonderful? Hospitality, healing, invitation, welcome, service, care for one another, and the many who come to our doors throughout the week and out into the community at large and even into our own homes. We come here, and the good news of Jesus Christ is proclaimed. And our hearts are lifted, and we find healing for the many cares and burdens we've been carrying in our lives. I know it's true for me, and many of you have said the same. One man said something once I thought was really good. He said he loves the fact that, as he put it, when he comes to church, he can lay his burdens down at the altar. He said, "I just have to remember not to pick him up and take him with me when I go back out the door." But I thought, is that not probably true of all of us, and why we keep coming back? We don't always find a miraculous cure that ends the fever of the moment, or the fever in the moment, but we do sense that this is a place of healing, a place by little we can find strength and encouragement and forgiveness and grace to meet a new day. That's what healing is in this place. And our gospel tells us today, somehow those healed become healers. You are, I know. Some of you are real handy with a blood pressure cuff, and some of you are handy with a hammer, and some of you know just the right thing to say when someone's heart is breaking, and others of you couldn't string 3 words together if your lives depended upon it, but somehow you managed to show that you care. Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law, and by that evening, Mark says the whole city was gathered around the door. A whole city full of hurting people sought out Jesus to heal them. In our gospel today, Jesus says he's come to preach, to proclaim the gospel, but it's very hard for him to get a chance to preach with so many hurting people clustering around him. So he reaches out to them. He touches them. He wades into their pain and takes some of it on himself, and they're healed. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the most powerful sermons don't have words. Thanks be to God.